Welcome to Emerging Franchise Brands, the podcast that introduces you to the visionary founders of America's fastest growing franchise opportunities. We'll also hear from industry pros as they share insights on what it really takes to achieve the elusive milestone of 100 plus locations. I am your host, Frank Feely, founder of I9 Sports, and my 20-year journey from inception to acquisition has given me a unique perspective on how to succeed in franchising. Join me as we welcome today's guest. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. On today's show, I have Richard Harmon, who is the co-founder of Exit Strategy Mastery and the managing director of CSG Partners, who have done over $2 billion in transactions. Richard, how are you today?
Hey, Frank, it's so wonderful to be with you. Thanks for inviting me on.
Thanks, Richard. It's great seeing you as always. So I think that we're doing obviously something a little bit different on today's show. We normally interview founders of emerging franchise systems or sometimes franchise pros. But I think this episode, to me, I was so looking forward to it. One, you've been a dear friend for many years. You and I have worked together. This is not having somebody on the show that I just know of. You're somebody who I've actually done business with and actually conducted a transaction through. But Richard, I would love for you to talk about exit strategy, because most founders of franchise systems, especially the ones I know, they start their business. They just think they have so much passion for it. They have no clue how it's going to end, what they're going to do. Are they going to sell it to somebody? Are they going to give it to the kids? They have no idea. So let's get into it and talk about exit strategy mastery and what it's all about.
Well, great question, Frank. And absolutely, there's a lot of statistics going on right now. One thing that struck me is that there's some 12 million baby boomer business owners that are retiring over the next decade, some 10,000 a day. As a matter of fact, over half of all what we call lower middle market businesses, which are businesses up to, let's say, 50 million of revenue, are owned by people 55 and older. And the key there is when you dive underneath that cover, it turns out that only about 30% will ever transition to a family member. It used to be that was a much higher number, but a lot of kids just don't want to go into the same business. And then there's another 20% that'll be sold. What does that mean? It means 50% of all these businesses, of those 12 million businesses, are just going to evaporate. They're going to liquidate. The owner is going to die in the saddle. There's going to be wealth destroyed. And one of the things in my, investment banking work, where we work with so many companies to get liquidity or exit primarily through selling shares to what's called an employee stock ownership plan, but also through M&A transactions when they sell to a third party or to private equity. One of the things that I've noticed over this last 12 years is so many companies just aren't prepared for that process. They leave money on the table, the deal gets delayed, it gets derailed, and they end up with a transaction that may never close. So my former business partner and current business partner again, Morty Levine, and I were talking about this, and we said, look, we collectively and separately own 22 businesses. We've had multiple successful exits. And to be honest, Morty is, in terms of, leadership, he's the manager leader. So I was always the vision guy, kind of the artist, and he was the manager leader. And when it came time to exit a variety of businesses, we were so well prepared that we got top dollar, we closed on time, and all those kind of things. And so what we've done in this Exit Strategy Mastery, and you go to exitstrategymastery.com, we've got a free book, 14 must-dos to maximize wealth when selling your business. We've also got another book on exploring employee ownership, which is simple and easy to read. And we've just been dumping information on people to get them to kind of wake up and not inadvertently destroy their wealth and their legacy.
Sure. So Richard, since so many of our listeners are emerging franchisors, let's paint the picture that we have an emerging franchisor that's listening. He or she only has 10, 15 franchise locations. They're only in their 30s, maybe early 40s. They're not even thinking exit. But I want to know, why is it important that they're listening to you now? Why is it so important that they think about the end game and the exit?
Well, it's interesting, and I was talking to a mutual friend of ours. I'm saying, look, every business should be thinking about this from the inception. You should be thinking about your exit,
Yes.
even as you're building your empire. And Frank, better than most. For those of you that don't know Frank's background deeply, with his I-9 Sports, he was pound for pound one of the best run small businesses in America. And I deal with dozens and dozens of transactions. And when Frank kindly mentioned the $2 billion in transactions, that's me personally. Our firm, we're a collective of 30 professionals. We've done $25 billion of transactions. And across, my entire career, which is I've been a CPA 40 years now. That's where I started out. And I worked with so many entrepreneurs and emerging businesses before I became an entrepreneur and built and sold a bunch of my own businesses. I got a lot of experience looking into the door, and Frank crushed it. His management team, his financial statements, his processes, his key performance indicators, all those things that are necessary to just hit the ball, and build value. And what's fascinating about the franchise space is franchisors rarely come to market. The franchisees come to market, and in order for a franchisee to sell, well, they're always going to need permission from the franchisor, but that's a separate discussion. But if you're able to build a thriving franchisor organization, you are going to command top dollar in the marketplace. But along the way, you want to pay attention to certain things. You want to make sure that your financial statements have integrity. Once you get to a certain size, you should invest at least in annual reviews, have your CPA review your financial statements, because eventually, if that either the bank or some third party is kicking the tires to buy you, if your financial statements have integrity, you're not going to take a haircut right out the gate in negotiations. But it really was a joy. I mean, Frank, it was about 8 years ago that we first started working together, and you've just knocked the ball out of the park. And I'm so pleased that you're stepping up and sharing your information for the next generation.
Thank you. I am so passionate about this because there's so much, there's so much I wish I had known when I had started out. And my motivation of starting this podcast is for people to learn through my journey and through others to not make the same mistakes. Hopefully I made so many mistakes, but we were quick learning from them. We didn't make the same mistake twice most of the time. But it was the proximity to meeting people such as yourself that really help us take the company to the next level. So, Richard, with that in mind, where I'd like to go with this is I would like to talk about an ESOP, because most people do not know what an ESOP is. So I want to keep this really, really basic. I just want to preface by saying that you and I met as a result of Tony Robbins at Business Mastery back in 2015. And Tony actually did an ESOP for his employees at Robbins Research. So let's start simple. Let's share with the audience, what does an ESOP even stand for, and what is its primary purpose?
Thank you. That's kind of like the perfect setup question for me. My passion is educating owners about different exit strategies, but also in particular, employee stock ownership plan. So what is an ESOP? It stands for Employee Stock Ownership Plan. The history goes kind of way back, but in the 50s, there was this gentleman, Louis Kelso. There's also this guy, Mortimer Adler, and they were proponents of inspiring owners to share equity with the employees. They said, look, America is a capitalist society. How do we create more capitalists? Wealth is concentrated. The more broad-based ownership we have in America, the more that America will thrive. And there was a first ESOP done in the late 50s. It was a printing company, and by 1974, they'd gotten the eyes and ears of Congress, and they were able to get ESOPs legislated along with IRAs and 401ks. So in 1974, there was something called the Employee Retirement Income Services Act that was passed, and that created ESOPs, 401ks, and IRAs. Kind of different retirement plans that had existed prior. And so what did that mean? It meant you could hire an independent trustee. You create your own buyer, essentially. You can hire an independent, ideally institutional trustee. And Congress said to that trustee, you're allowed to buy shares from the selling shareholder at fair market value. Do not pay more than fair market value, but you can buy shares from the company on behalf of a trust for the employees. So that's when ESOPs started. And then 10 years later, they tried to come up with additional benefits to inspire owners. So they created something called a 1042 rollover. So if you sell 30% or more of the shares of your company to a retirement trust for your employees.
Who, by the way, the employees are not paying for it. It is not coming out.
Yeah, that's a key.
The employees
that's one of the best. Oh my gosh, they could never afford to buy the shares. What's happened over the decades since 74 all the way to now, Congress kept bolting on huge tax incentives that basically pay for the whole thing. Let's pretend we sell 30% of the company for $10 million to the retirement trust.
And that's because the company was valued at $10 million. So we get a valuation first.
We're selling 30% of it. That company's
right
at 10 million. The company's valued at what, 35 million.
Right. Okay. So the company's worth 35 million. It's valued.
And we're going to sell 30%. Let's say it's worth 33 million, and we're going to sell 30% for $10 million.
So let's use me as the example. So I'm the only owner of the company, or my wife and I are the only owners of the company. And we say, you know what? We want to take some chips off the table. You know, we're getting a little older and we don't want to sell the company. We're not ready to give up control. We don't want our competition to know about the sale, but we want to reward our employees and we don't want to pay any taxes today.
I'll switch over to a simpler example. Let's pretend the whole company's worth $10 million.
Okay.
It's making $2 million a year.
Mm-hmm.
And it's worth 5 times the fair market value, 5 times. Typically, companies are worth 4.5 to 10, 12 times. Interesting, in your particular niche, there's a premium. So it's more like 10 times, not 5 times.
Mm-hmm.
But $2 million in annual earnings, probably paying close to $1 million in taxes. If they're in a high tax state, they got $1 million left over. The company's worth 5 times what we call EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and that's $10 million. And so what are your options? Well, if you just sold your company to a third party for $10 million, in California, you'd net $6.3 million. In Florida, you'd net $8 million. This is because of the capital gains rates. If your particular company has a lot of equipment and you took a lot of bonus depreciation, your taxes are even higher because you think you're getting capital gains treatment, but you end up getting ordinary income treatment for a big chunk. So you could end up paying 50% or more in taxes on that sale. So that's always one door. And to your point, Frank, if you're going out to market with your particular franchise operation, you're opening the kimono to your competitors. Right. Oh, this is how these guys do business. This is why they're so successful. And then it's, well, should we buy them? Or, well, we just learned how they do what they do. Maybe we'll just do it ourselves. Right. And now you've created a competitor, right? But with an ESOP, you don't do that. So you get this eligible known buyer, which is this trustee who buys the shares on behalf. And we might say to you, initially, you'll say, we want to be here for another 5, 10 years. Let's get our toe in the water. And if you sell 30% or more to the trust, you get to defer your capital gains. You get a year to reinvest in other stuff. Stocks and bonds of U.S. operating companies. You can do actively managed real estate. There's something called a floating rate note. There's a way to reinvest, and then you get to defer your gains. And there's an art to that, so that ideally you'll invest in stuff that you'll own all the way till you pass away, and then you'll get a stepped up basis, never pay capital gains. There's an art to that. It goes outside the scope of this conversation. But in this case, so let's say, you and your wife want to explore this. So we'll do an analysis. We'll say, hey, why don't you sell 30 to 49% of this company initially to the ESOP trust? It's worth $10 million. Okay, we'll get you, let's say we sell 49%. We'll get you 4.9 million, probably get you 5 million or a little bit more, actually, even though we're selling 49%. And now you're going to sell $5 million of shares to the retirement trust. They're going to sit unallocated. We can go out to a bank and put debt on your company up to about 3.5 times EBITDA. In your case, your EBITDA is 2 million, so we could raise the whole 5 million.
So I am the owner. I'm getting a check for $5 million.
Correct.
And then I'm going to reinvest that, like you said, in stocks, bonds, floating rate notes, actively managed real estate. I'm not paying any taxes upfront on that $5 million. My employees in return are getting shares of stock of the company that they can't cash in. It goes into
Correct.
a retirement account. And I continue to run the company like I did
Correct.
yesterday. Nothing changes, except
Correct.
I have a relationship now with a trustee, and the trustee is somebody who is sort of like the representative for the employees, right? That's the best way to describe them.
They're a fiduciary watching out for the employee's interests.
Yes.
So just to dive a little deeper, we would have gone out and written a financial information memorandum for the company, and we would have circulated it and done a competitive auction to raise capital. So we would have reached out to 10. This is my putting on my CSG managing director ESOP hat. We'd go out and we circulate that financial information to 10 to 30 banks, probably get 3 or 4 term sheets. Here's how much money they're willing to lend, at what rates. Our claim to fame is we raise more money to finance leveraged ESOP transactions, which means you're borrowing money from a bank with no personal guarantees than all the other advisors combined. We raise close to $1 billion each year to finance these transactions. And one of the reasons so many banks are willing to lend to employee stock ownership companies is because of the tax benefits, which I'll address in a little bit. Because of those tax benefits, ESOP companies, even partial ESOP companies, have a lot more after-tax cash flow to be able to service that debt. So we went out and borrowed $5 million. Now today, that's going to be at 7.5%. Standard overnight funds rate called SOFR, plus 2%, way up from a year ago. That interest is still deductible from the company. The other interesting thing about this ESOP is when you go out and borrow money, I know I can get into the weeds here, you get to pay it off with pre-tax instead of after-tax dollars. So you get to pay it down a lot faster. What we'll do is we'll borrow $5 million by the company, no personal guarantees to you and your wife, Frank.
Right.
And then the company will loan that $5 million to the retirement trust. The retirement trust will hand $5 million to you and your wife. You will hand $5 million in shares to the trust. And when we're done with all this, the trust owes the company $5 million. The company owes the bank $5 million.
Right. I don't personally, that's what I wanted to get to. I personally, Frank, the owner of the company, do not owe the bank the $5 million. My company does. My company basically bought me out.
Yes. Well, in this case, they bought you out for half.
Right.
Well, 49%.
Right. Only half. All right. I let the company only buy half of the company from me.
In this example, right? And we'll talk about how it gets even more amazing if you become what's known as 100% ESOP. So at this point, you got $5 million. You have a year. It's called a 1042 rollover to reinvest and defer all your capital gains. The company owes the bank $5 million. If something happens to the company and the company goes under for some reason, there are no personal guarantees. Your $5 million is safe outside of the business. The ESOP now owns $5 million of shares, and it owes the company for those shares. So each year, the company will make a contribution to the ESOP trust, typically 25% of your payroll, sometimes some dividends. The ESOP trust will hand it right back to the company in payment of that $5 million note.
It is circular.
So, it's circular. So let's say, so maybe it would do a $250,000 contribution. The $250,000 would come right back to the company. Now the trust is allocating 250 divided by 5 million, 5%, I think, of the shares to all the employees based on their W-2 salaries. They get allocated shares based on their W-2 salaries of whatever pool of shares is available each year.
Right. So this is not discretionary. Me as the owner, I can't decide, I really like my director of IT. He's such a good guy. I want him to get X. My director of marketing, he's fairly new. No, that's not how it works.
Correct. It's governed by the IRS and Department of Labor.
Perfect.
And they wanted to be fair. So they said, look, if you're making 100,000 and your person sitting next to you is making 50, you're going to get allocated double the shares.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So all the way up to about 315,000, the shares get allocated based on your W-2 salaries relative to everyone else. And then above that is disregarded for tax purposes, or it's disregarded. You're not allowed to be allocated shares if it's above 315,000. So now your employees get allocated shares. Once a year, they get a statement. Here's how many shares you've been allocated. Here's how many shares you're vested in. Typically, you vest over 6 years, years 2 through 6, like a 401k, 20% a year. And then at a certain point in time, it's a retirement plan. Each year, hey, here's how many shares I've been allocated. Here's how many shares I'm vested in. And here's the value of those shares. And the first couple of years, the company's paying off $5 million of debt. So there's not a whole lot of money there. But after those first few years, what I see, years 3, 4, and 5, typically people's accounts start to hockey stick. Some companies have 50 employees generating 5 million in profits a year. Other companies will have 10 employees doing that. Other companies will have 300. It all depends on the ratio of employees to headcount as to what it means. But here's a really interesting statistic that I just heard from the CSG founder, Larry Kaplan. In 2022, we have clients, and it was like you, Frank. You did the ESOP transaction back in 2015.
Right.
And a few years later, you said, Richard, I'm burnt out. I've been running this thing since the 90s. And now I've stepped up to chairman, but I'm still working too hard. I really want to just have a final sale. Without talking numbers for you said to me he goes, if I had waited and sold to private equity, I would have netted less because you got to sell a big chunk and defer all your gains on the first part.
And I made all my money when I deferred. All that money just happened to hit it with the market, but I was able to invest all that money that I got. So I was reaping the benefits of the market. Yeah, you got a tremendous amount of liquidity and diversification. And then you got another paycheck. And when you got that second sale paycheck, the interesting part was the impact to your employees. In your case, it was, you ended up with more money than if you waited and sold and paid capital gains on the whole amount. Instead, you got to get a bunch of money off the table, not pay capital gains on that. And then when you sold the company, not only did you end up with more after-tax cash, all things considered, but your employees, you can explain what happened there. Yeah, I need to pause you there, Richard, because this was one of the most defining moments of my time of ever being a business owner. It was one thing to allocate the shares. When I announced them to my employees, guys, I have great news for you. I've sold the company to you. When I said that to them in early 2016, of course, they were shocked. They had no idea what that meant. And you prepared me. You said they're not going to know what that means. Make sure you prepare them. So we knew that education of an ESOP is extremely important and ongoing communication, right? So they get all these shares, but they can't do anything with those shares until I decide with the trustee to sell. Now, obviously in 2017, we had an incredible opportunity to actually sell and to go through the liquidity transaction. And I have got to say that that was one of the most defining moments in my career for my wife and I to sit down with our CEO and our CFO and bring in one employee at a time and tell them how much money they just got, like literally in cash, that they were able to convert their shares to, because the shares probably like tripled in price. And now because we had the liquidity event, they could cash in. I don't know if there was enough tissue boxes to get us through the day. And I will spare sharing individual stories because of time, but I got to tell you though, it was life-changing for my wife and I, as much as it was life-changing for my employees, on not just a financial level, but emotional, because I didn't realize the amount of impact I was really making on my employees' lives. And it did change them. They always treated the company before they were ESOP owners, before they were owners of the company, they treated it like they were owners of the company, right? They didn't act differently once they were ESOP owners. However, if somebody's not the right employee, they're not going to be the right employee before an ESOP or after an ESOP. It doesn't change anybody. But the lives that you can impact and rewarding your employees who got you there. It wasn't me that got I9 Sports to where it was. It was an entire team that did it. And to reward them made it all the more worthwhile. And on top of that, to have it tax deferred was just absolutely the cherry on top. I did not do it for tax deferment. I did it for the primary reason I knew it was time for me to move on. And I couldn't think of a better way to do it than pay the employees. Don't pay Uncle Sam. and that was so important for me. But Richard, what I like to segue to real quick is, because I know people are thinking this, am I really eligible? Like, can any business set up an ESOP? I want to hear about what specific criteria there is in order for me to be ESOP eligible.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I just want to finish that thought for a second, Frank, and then we'll go into ESOP eligibility, because it's a little bit lower standard because the multiples are so high for a franchisor versus somebody who might be in a different type of service business or construction or the like. But I was at a meeting about 90 days ago, and somebody came up to me, goes, "Oh, Richard, I know you." And I said, "I don't think I know you." He goes, "Well, you did my ESOP." I said, "Same as Jim." I said, "Jim, I'd remember if I did your ESOP." He goes, "No, CSG did my ESOP." And I probably met him in the office back in the day, about 6 or 7 years ago. And he had just sold the company. And he said, "I have to tell you, because I did that ESOP, he got liquidity and diversification, just financial diversification, meaning you were able to reinvest, Frank, and he was able to do the same thing. And his was an insurance agency, which also commands a really high multiple." And he said, he goes, "I'm 68 years old, and I got this business. I took it over from my father, and I had a lot of employees that are in retirement years now. And my receptionist, who'd been with me forever and been with my father, was earning $80,000 a year, and she got 1.7 million into her retirement plan, which set her up for the rest of her life." He said, just like you, Frank, it was the most impactful moment, he said, other than the birth of his kids and grandkids.
I
he couldn't believe. And a lot of people don't do that, but there's an interesting statistic which kicked this all off is Larry just shared that in 2022 alone, not every ESOP generates that kind of value per employee, but many do. And most employees across all ESOPs, there's some 6,500 in the country, they'll end up with 4 times what they would have in a 401k. They end up making 90% more on average. They end up getting laid off less. All these wonderful things happen to companies that have ESOPs in place. But one of the most interesting things was, ESOPs always, they don't stay there forever. After you go a certain amount of years, maybe the younger employees, there's not many shares left over. They're not getting an allocation. And a lot of companies will sell like you did. Mm-hmm. And when they sell, the employees don't have to wait till they hit retirement milestones to be able to get their hands on the share value. They get it all at once. And Larry shared that in 2022 alone, with transactions that we did for clients we've done ESOPs for in the past, created 300 to 500 new millionaires among employees. That's just CSG. And that statistic, which I just heard in the last 24 hours, was mind-boggling to me, because along the way, the owners get liquidity, they get diversification, they get more after-tax cash flow in their hands to reinvest. The company gets to deduct that whole transaction, and the employees have this opportunity to have this great experience. Now, what's a good ESOP candidate? You gotta build something of value. Classic example, I had a company who was doing $1 million in profits and $6 million of revenue, an engineering firm in California. And I said, "Well, what do you think you're worth?" He goes, "I don't know, 3-4 million, 3 to 4 times his EBITDA." And I said, "Yeah, I would agree." I said, "If I can get you to 3 to 5 million in profits," and the hard part was getting from 0 to 1 million in profits.
It always is.
0 to 6 million. That's the Herculean lift, right?
Right.
But getting from a place where you already have some mass and you have some profits to a bigger level of that is easier. And he called me back 3 years later. So that was in 2019, this conversation. Called me back, and 3 years later, goes, "Richard, I'm at 26 million in revenue, and I'm at 6 million in EBITDA. And we sold 40% of a company that was only worth 3 to 4 million in 2019, 40% of the company for $20 million. And he still owns 60%. And I say that because to every budding franchisor out there, you are creating equity. You can't touch it yet, but you've got a multiple. And in a franchisor, I would say it's an 8 to 12 spread. Maybe, Frank, you're more dialed into the industry right now. Maybe, and the bigger you get and the more interesting your niche is.
It could be significantly higher if you're doing really well. But yeah, I think that's fair. It's, double digit.
For us, if we've got somebody who's earning more than $10 million in revenue on an annual basis, the banks will play. They'll lend. When I have somebody, even if they're making 10 million in revenue, if they're making 8 million of revenue and 4 million of profits, a lot of the banks won't lend. It's just a weird thing. It's just this kind of $10 million
So
cutoff.
$10 million revenue is sort of your
revenue.
Okay. Yep.
Is that allows us to raise capital. We'll still, if somebody's under that, they're very profitable and they're under 10 million, we may get one bank or two banks to play. But if we get you over 10 million, we'll probably have 4 or 5 term sheets. And that's where you're going to get the best deal. So that's on getting you money at closing if you do an ESOP. And then on the flip side of it is with earnings, if I've got somebody, our sweet spot is 3 million to 5 million profits and more. Because if you're worth 3 million, a typical company might be worth 6x, 18 million. 5 million would be worth 30 million, right? Or 6 times 5 is 30 million.
Right. If you did, you said 3 million EBITDA times the 5 is 15. But the sweet spot, I'd say is right. You want to get over that 3 million EBITDA.
Right. But in a franchisor situation, a 3 million EBITDA company wouldn't be worth 6x. It's probably
30.
worth 10x.
Yeah. You're talking 30 million bucks. Absolutely. Minimum.
So, I was on the phone just recently in the last 24 hours with an owner. Started about when you did, Frank. He had 4 employees when he started. I'm not going to talk about the industry, the space, et cetera. Now he's got 162 people and he's growing. He went from 40 million in revenue this year. He's going to be 50 million next year, and 15% hits the bottom line. So his incremental profits are going to go up $1.5 million next year.
Wow.
He's in a space that also pays a high multiple. He's creating $15 million of equity by us waiting a little bit to do his ESOP, or we'll sell 30%, we'll sell a small amount because the stock's still growing in value so rapidly. But the point of it is, if you are a budding franchisor, for every $100,000 in profits you bring to the bottom line, you're creating about $1 million in equity. Needs to be sustainable. But, I had a technology staffing firm in the 90s. We did $1.8 million our first year. We figured out how to expand nationally. We did 18 million the second year. We doubled again, and we sold to a company, went public. But in that first year, my business partner, Morty, and I, who were now doing exit strategy mastery together, we pulled out 20 grand because the company needed every nickel to pay our programmers. We have to pay our programmers in 30 days, and Pfizer and Goldman Sachs, they weren't paying us for like 60 days, and some weren't paying us till 90 days. So it absorbed all the cash. And I said, we're not pulling out any money, but we're creating all this equity. And Morty's, tell that to the cab driver, see if he'll take us back downtown. We were in New York City because he thought it was BS, and we were. And so every budding franchisor, you're in a niche that if you can successfully grow your business for that each $100,000 profit, you can't touch it right away. But you get to that 30, you just created $30 million. Now get to 10. You just created $100 million.
Right. And that's why we want to prepare our franchisor friends listening to think about exit now, even, starting out or early in the game, so that you can prepare for this. And okay, here's something else that you shared with me years ago. I'll never forget. I said to you, all right, Richard, this just sounds too good to be true. And you said to me, the reason why this is not going to go away is because both sides of the aisle love it. Can you share what you meant by that?
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting because I haven't gone through that in a while, but so Republicans love it because they love owners getting liquidity on a tax advantage basis. And Democrats love it because they love the idea of employee ownership. And some Republicans love it also because of the idea of strengthening the empire of, the United States by having more stakeholders. It's just been a win-win. So in 84, they came out with that 1042 where you could defer your gains. And then in 98, between 74 and 98, you had to be a C Corp if you were an ESOP. And then they allowed S Corp ESOPs. People stopped doing ESOPs. They said, if I'm just an LLC or an S, I've got pass-through, so my taxes will be lower than if I'm a C Corp and I pay taxes, and then I get a dividend, I pay taxes. They said, well, we'll allow S Corp ESOP. So if you're 100% S Corp ESOP, starting January 99, the K1 goes to the retirement trust, doesn't pay federal or state taxes. You're tax-free in perpetuity. And then it got even a little better. The IRS came up with something called, I know I'm in the weeds again, Reg 409P in 2004. people got tricky. They say, oh, well, I'm going to sell 100% to the S Corp ESOP and 99, but I'm going to issue warrants to myself for 90%. So I have the rights years later to buy back 90% of the company for a little bit of money. And what happens to the benefit to the employees? It goes away. So IRS said, that's too greedy. You can't do that. But we will allow you to own up to 49%. This is where it's really in the weeds and wonky. In synthetic equity, options, stock appreciation rights, warrants, the right to buy back shares up to 49%. Now, practically, you don't want to get to 49% because if you tip over, and it can happen in some accidental ways, it's tax Armageddon. You just don't want to get there. So we'll bring people back to my $10 million example. First, we sold 49%. We raised $5 million from the bank. The owner got $5 million. Company gets $5 million in deductions. The employees get allocated that $5 million of shares. And over time, hopefully the company's growing and that $5 million is going to be worth even more. And at retirement milestones, they get to sell their shares back. Or if the whole company sells, everybody wins. So now let's switch it up a little bit. Let's sell 75% of that company to the retirement trust, right? So $7.5 million.
Right. So the benefit now is I'm the owner. I'm going to take a little more chips off the table instead in this case.
Right. And maybe we can raise $6 million at closing. So now you're going to get a $6 million check at closing, plus $1.5 million in seller notes. The company will still end up owing you that.
And I still control the company.
You still,
still run it.
Well, we refer to it as governance.
Okay.
The trick is when you sell a majority, if we sell 75%, if you get paid a control premium, because there is something called in the market called a control premium, where if you buy a control in a company, that's worth a premium. If you get paid a control premium, well, we don't want that to happen. We want you to get paid a fair price, but governance of every company in America sits with the board of directors.
Right.
Now, if you're a small franchisor, that's probably just you. But at some point in time, I can't remember, Frank, whether you had, some of your officers, your president on the board with you, and then the trustee is going to ask you to add one independent board member, but the trustee typically is not on the board. But so let's talk about governance for a minute. So the ESOP trustee gets to vote whatever percent of the shares. So if it's got 30% of the shares, it gets to vote 30% of the shares. Each year, the board's going to present a slate of directors, and it's going to advise the trustee how to vote its shares for the board. And the board has the option to replace the trustee. So even if 100% of the outstanding shares are owned by the retirement trust, the board still governs. The board advises the trustee how to vote its shares for the board. Right. And by the way, the trustee knows that the board is basically the management team that brought the company to this level of success. So I've had no instance where they've ever been in an adversary position. Right. But the board can replace the trustee. So even 100%. Think about Apple, right? The board maybe owns 3%, 6% of Apple, but they govern
the whole company.
The whole company. So governance stays in place.
Okay, so I should have said governance. I should have said governance, and not control.
Yeah, well, governance. Now governance is control. It's just
right.
It's just a less. It has less.
It sounds nicer.
Edge on it, I guess.
Okay, and one more thing. By the way, I picked the trustee.
Well, yes, in an indirect way. It's actually a committee of your non-owner employees that picked the trustee. Right. You may not recall, but we hired legal counsel. Legal counsel worked with a few of your employees in a committee that didn't have, that wasn't a family member and didn't have, and then they interviewed multiple trustees and they chose a trustee.
Yes, we knew basically it was a very small group. It was not a very large group pool to pick from.
And the truth of it is, if you don't like how things are proceeding as you go down the ESOP path, it takes about 4 to 6 months to get the whole thing done. You can unwind the process at any time. Yeah. All the way up till the night before, really. Yeah.
So Richard, first of all, I want to put their mind at ease knowing that, first of all, you don't have to think about any of this. Okay, guys, CSG Partners will take care of all of the structure and all of the options. They'll run through with you one question at a time and tell you what the pros and cons are of each thing. So don't hopefully you're not getting caught up too much in some of the weeds that Rich and I are talking about, but let's take the audience into very simple terms again, the process. I'm a founder. I want to do this. Richard, I remember the first conversation we had, you came to my office, and tell the group, what is the process of actually setting up an ESOP?
Yes. And we like to think, we've evolved our process over the couple of decades we've been doing this. And what we like to do is show the owner their future. We say, hey, you can go through this door. Door number one is you don't do anything differently. You just keep running your business. This is how much you're going to earn on an after-tax basis over the next 5 years or 10 years. Here's how much tax you're going to pay based on your projections over all those years. And then there's 400 flavors of ESOP. We'll use, we've got kind of an extensive brain trust. We'll tee up some optimal pathway for you and show you what a leveraged ESOP looks like. How much money do we think we can raise at what rates? What do we think the value of your company is? Just when you think about a commercial building, there's only so many ways to value a commercial building. There's cash flow, there's the land, different elements. Same thing with businesses. We know how to value businesses. So we will value your business to give you a sense of what we think it's worth. Now, that valuation isn't going to count. We just want to show you what we think you're worth and how much capital we think we can raise and what that's going to do to your future, okay, in terms of after-tax cash flow. Typically, it'll magnify it 3 to 5 times or so over the first 5 years. What's it going to do for the company's tax position? How much taxes are you going to save? What's it going to do with your employees over 5-10 year periods? So we give you that entire view. And what I do is I tell people, if you don't feel you got full value, we'll refund the whole thing. Once in a while, I think only one time in many dozens of transactions have I ever been burned on that, where the guy goes, man, I just want a refund. No, it was great. I love your work.
He was just searching for information, probably.
Yeah, which some people do, but that's part of being a business owner. You're always looking for more information. But
absolutely.
So that's the first part of the process. Now we collect 5 years of financial history, a current tax return, projections, and employee census information. And it depends on your industry. We ask for some other things. It's not a whole lot of information. It takes us 3 weeks to do the analysis, and we present the analysis. You say, well, this is interesting, and I want to go forward. What's the next step? So now what we do is we write a financial memorandum. We call it a confidential information memorandum, a CIM. CIM is what our acronym is. And we collect more information. We sit down with you. In your case, Frank, we documented the whole history of the business, all the amazing things you were doing for youth sports around the country, all the financial information about your business. We also look at the industry and what other competitors are doing and we put all that into a 40 to 60 page memorandum. And once you approve of that memorandum, which takes us 3 to 4 weeks to write, then we circulate it to all the banks and we get our term sheets, which takes another 3 weeks, 4 weeks or so. And once we get those term sheets, and now we know how much money you're going to get at closing, right? And at what terms. And if you like that, then we say, Frank, okay, you want to go to the next step. We know we've got the financing aligned. Now's the time to go through the process to engage the trustee. Let's get legal counsel involved. We want to have you distance. We don't want you picking the trustee directly because it's like picking your own home buyer. We need to have some distance for the valuation. And so at that point, you'll pick this trustee. The trustee will have a due diligence meeting. So you remember, we all got together in your office. We had the ESOP attorney, we had the trustee's attorney, we had the trustee's valuation firm. They go hire their own independent valuation firm. They start with our financial memorandum, but then they ask more questions. And then their valuation guy goes off and does 3 or 4 weeks of work and then whispers into the trustee's ear what they think the valuation range is. Now, we've already done all that work in advance, so we're pretty good at estimating.
Yes,
but we never know what that valuation firm is gonna say, and then we start the negotiation. So we offer to sell the shares at a certain price. They typically counter at an obnoxiously low price, and over time, through several weeks and multiple iterations, once we hit a price that we can agree on, then we proceed to closing. And it's a 4 to 6 week process. Now, in my second example, we're going to sell 75%. You get $6 million at closing plus $1.5 million in seller notes. The trustee owes the company for $7.5 million. But now I'm going to take, and you sold 75% of the company. So 75% of the shares are sitting in the trust unallocated.
Right.
Okay. And now we're going to redeem the remaining 25% shares for warrants. And because we're redeeming actual equity, 25% actual equity, and because you have seller notes where you're due a very high rate of interest, mezzanine interest, we'll say, Frank, don't take a 12, 15% coupon on that $1.5 million in seller notes. Take the minimum the IRS allows, the AFR rate it's called. And because of that, we'll end up getting you a pool of close to 40% warrants, right? And now something magical has happened. The 75% that the trust owns, the other 25% disappears. You end up with warrants, 40% warrants.
Which are like options, basically.
Options to buy back. Okay, let's just walk through it. It's a little bit different than this because there's a complicated math involved. But when you sold 75%, that was $7.5 million. Well, in this case, we're actually putting $7.5 million of debt on the company.
Right.
Company owes the bank $6 million and it owes you $1.5 million. So now this, pre-ESOP, it was worth 10. Post-ESOP, right now, because of the $7.5 million debt to you in the bank, it's only worth 2.5.
Right.
So post-transaction, 40% of 2.5 is $1 million. So your strike price
is low.
But then as the 7.5 gets paid down, just naturally, you get back to 10 million equity again, even if the company doesn't grow, and your 40% is now worth 4, and you're back in the money $3 million on your warrants.
So just by the company paying back the debt, my warrants are becoming worth more money.
As do the employees' shares.
Exactly.
They end up in this case. So, but what's interesting here, because we went through this exercise and you turned your real remaining equity into the right to buy back equity, now 100% is owned by the retirement trust and the company's tax-free in perpetuity. So 100% of your cash flow is available to A, pay down that debt to you in the bank, the 6 million and the 1.5, and B, to have extra working capital to build the company
forever.
And if you go out and acquire somebody, they end up becoming tax-free, and you can end up paying down the purchase price with their own pre-tax dollars twice as fast. It just gets really interesting. So what we do in our process, first we show you what it means. And typically we'll say, let's sell 30 to 49%. And then we'll say, usually 3 or 4 years later, okay, now let's sell another chunk and then convert to warrants the balance. One interesting spot here, coming all the way back, we talked about how all the shares in the retirement trust get allocated to employees based on their annual W-2 salaries. But we always set aside some additional shares, stock appreciation rights, that we can sprinkle however you like towards your key drivers, towards your key managers, your key, you might have a president, you might have folks that you want to have. Yes, they're going to get shares allocated in the ESOP, but they'll also get shares allocated outside. You have more control over those outside shares. So if your senior person quits and goes to somebody else, you can claw back those stock appreciation rights, whereas whatever they're allocated in the ESOP, they still get the benefits too. So I know we've been kind of really deep in the weeds here, but the option is you got liquidity, you get diversification, the company can become tax-free in perpetuity. Your employees are going to get a benefit they would never be able to accrue. It's just a win-win. And now, the issue for me is only 1/2 of 1%. It's actually even less than that. It's 0.4%. So 96.6% of all owners, when they do sell, they go through a third party or private equity route. The irony is private equity does the same thing we do. They go out to the same banks and financial institutions, raise the money. They're leveraging up your own balance sheet. But when they pay it down, well, A, they've taken control of your company and they've probably given you a little more cash at closing, but B, it has to be paid down with after-tax dollars. It's just really fascinating. So we're masters at showing you your future through these different doorways.
Yes.
But for some companies, there's strategic buyers, like classic example, Google bought YouTube. Now it's Alphabet, but when it was Google, it bought YouTube. It didn't have earnings or profits. It was losing a ton of money. And they paid $1.4 billion for it. Why? Because they saw if they plugged it into the Google network, they could do all these other things. So once in a while, when you have a strategic buyer, that's the door you go through. If you're an IPO candidate, that's going to be the door you go through, because that's going to create even more magnified wealth. But that's such a fraction.
Sure.
But for typical businesses with financial buyers, a financial buyer, somebody's paying multiple times EBITDA. It's private equity. It's a third party. An ESOP is a great compare and contrast.
It sure is.
And we do have a nice free ebook that explains ESOPs simply. If you go to exitstrategymastery.com, I think you click on services, and through the web page, there's different links where you can download. There's another ebook that I would suggest for everybody to download, which is something we call 14 must-dos to maximize wealth when selling your business. And what we've done, Morty and I put together a lot of things that we've done, and plus all the best practices in selling your business. And it's a quick read, and you need to start doing those things. Make sure your financial statements have integrity.
Absolutely.
Right? You Frank, just how your whole operating infrastructure, it's really, really fascinating for me. There's so many moving parts to a well-run business, and it's just I get excited when I get on a call with somebody who's started something from nothing, like you did, Frank, and then grown it to size and mass, and every business is delivering some positive service. Otherwise, it's not survivable.
Yeah.
Bring it all the way home. I had the opportunity to talk with Tony a year before you and I talked, Frank. We got to structure his transaction. We didn't get to do his capital raise, which was annoying to me, but because that's what we do best. But his company's been tax-free in perpetuity since 2014.
Right.
And the impact to his employees has just been wild. It's been fun to watch, because they reach out to me on the side. They say, "Yeah, look what my statement is. When am I going to get my hands on this money?" I said, "Well, unfortunately for you, Tony's never going to sell his business because it's his brand. And so you've got to wait for the normal retirement milestone. So you got to be in the plan 10 years. So plan's 10 years old in 2024. Mm-hmm. And then if you're 55 years old, you can sell 25% of your stake. And at 60, you can sell some more and put that money in your 401k and keep deferring it." It's been wonderful for me, because it does have a great impact. The owners are already doing really well. Yeah, they're at the top of the pyramid already, right?
Right.
But it magnifies the owner's wealth, and it creates a benefit for the employees that they would otherwise never see.
One thing I think we should, just full transparency for people, who is not a good fit for an ESOP? And I'm not talking about financially, but I mean, who is not a really good fit as a owner of a company?
I think if you get somebody who just really wants to throw the keys on the table,
mm-hmm.
If you don't, this applies across all sales. Your company, you want it to be in place to run without you. Any buyer that's looking at your company, if you're the one who's making everything happen, they don't want you to go anywhere, right? And also, they're going to pay less because they've got a weird form of concentration in the founder. They're stuck with having, we talk about concentration risk. You don't want to have, it's one of the 14 must-dos. You don't want to be, have Walmart as your one client, right?
Right.
It just
right.
means your revenue stream in the future is at risk. You don't want to have only one vendor that you can source your special elixir from, because something can happen to the vendor. So same thing with management. So I think if somebody is at the position that they just want to throw the keys on the table and they're just done, they can do that. A lot of companies we talked about how 30% will transition mm-hmm. to family members, and ESOPs also are very beneficial that way. Another 20% will sell. A lot more than that are probably trying to sell, but another 20% will sell. 50% will end up doing, the liquidation or bankruptcy, right? Which is, when you liquidate, you sell all the assets of the company, you do this, that, and the other thing. Owner gets a final check, maybe it's a few $1 million. And so I'm just trying to think of industries where it doesn't make sense at all. It's usually on the other end. It's usually because, like, if you're a SaaS company, software as a service, again, the ESOP is a financial buyer. They'll pay what a normal financial buyer would pay, but SaaS companies attract strategic buyers. So all of a sudden you might get a company paying multiples of, instead of 10 times EBITDA, they'll pay 10 times revenue. Well, you're going to go through that door. But, ESOPs, work across so many industries. Construction is one that we're doing an awful lot of ESOPs for because they typically don't have a great buyer, but it's construction, manufacturing, retail, just healthcare, professional services. If where it doesn't work, here's a good one, Frank, is if you've got a small medical practice or dental practice and you're in a state that doesn't allow what's called corporate practice of medicine, meaning a non-physician can't own shares in the professional corp.
Right.
That's how it is in California. Well, now let's say you're making $3 million a year and you're grossing, let's say you're doing 10 million in revenue and 3 million a year, and you're a medical practice in California. I can't get you 6 times the 3. I got to get you to set up a management company. I can only get in California 28% of that 3 million into the management company. So let's just call it $1 million, even though it's a little less than that. And then I can ESOP the management company, but I can't get you the 18 to 30 million. I can get you now 3 to 5 million
because of the medical practice. Yeah.
Because of the licensing.
Sure.
And they're trying to loosen it. Matter of fact, one of the biggest ESOPs, typically accounting's the same way. A huge ESOP just happened. They sold 40% of BDO, which is like the 7th largest accounting firm, for $1.4 billion. And or $1.2 billion. I was thinking $1.2 billion or $1.4 billion. And Apollo, which is a big private debt fund, funded the whole thing. So I think some companies are challenging to sell. You want to go through those 14 things because you just, again, you want to be the one that can step away.
Exactly.
I have a buddy of mine. He had a big plumbing HVAC business. And he grew up from 2 guys in a truck right out of high school. He and his buddy to 200 guys and 170 trucks. And he sold that business. He got it to 38 million in revenue and he sold it in 2015. And a couple of years later, he says, well, I know this is kind of like what you know. Well, he started consulting for all these other plumbers, electricians. Hey, here's how you end up working on your business. Now, typically plumber, they're under the sink, right? Well, how do you build an organization? And he had a great series of techniques to get him from 900,000 revenue to $1.1 million or from, $1.8 million or whatever. And he ended up having a few hundred businesses that were paying him a nice monthly amount to help them grow their businesses. Think of, business mastery, but just for that niche.
Right.
And he called up during the pandemic. He goes, hey, this private equity partner, he wanted to just pay me this big check. And I said, well, yeah, it seems like a big check. I said, but there's you and your partner. And he was in New Jersey. So, 33% is going to evaporate on the sale. And I said, you should really consider a partial ESOP. I said, you're the front face of this business. You're the one who's on stage. You're the one doing all this, that, and the other thing. And it was very profitable, this, that, and the other thing. And we did an analysis for him. And by the way, the private equity, when pandemic hit, they stepped back. So now he's looking at the ESOP. This is all in 2020. We get to December 14th. I remember he called me up. He goes, Richard, I sold the company, because the private equity came back and he sold it. And I said, it's great. I said, but now you're stuck working for them because you're the face of the business and you're not going to like that. You haven't worked for anybody since ever, So he goes, Richard, I'm your poster boy for telling people to think about an ESOP and not private equity. He goes, because it was miserable. And he goes, it's exactly what you said. And by the way, when you boiled it all down, he could have sold 30% and just had a few million less than what they netted after selling 75%. And I won't get into the math, but he said, Richard, I'm your poster boy. And so he couldn't stand it so much that he extracted himself. I don't even know what it cost him to get out, of the other business. And now he's kind of biding his time till his non-compete is done. And he's just a wonderful entrepreneur. But he goes, Richard, do you ever want to put me on a podcast? He goes, I'll let people know they should explore the store. So you get the benefits. You get governance. You get liquidity on an after-tax basis. You're doing something wonderful for your team, especially if you end up selling 3, 5, 10 years later. They're going to get all that money right away. They're not going to have to wait till they're 65. But even if they do have to wait until retirement age, they're going to have more money than they would ever have. Like my buddy with his commercial insurance company, that now his receptionist is set, for the rest of her incarnation. So yeah, I could go on and on about this stuff.
Wow.
But
Richard, this has been this has been so informative. I was so excited to have you on because obviously I went through this experience It was life-changing for my family and for my employees. And I just thought it's very unique. A lot of people in franchising do not know about the power of an ESOP. It's not something we talk about. It's never at any of the IFA events or anything like that, but it is an alternative since there's so many founders that are being confronted by private equity now more than ever in our industry. I thought this was the perfect timing to have you on the show and to talk about the alternative exit strategy. So with that said, tell us again how folks can get in touch with you.
Well, a couple ways. First, you can go to exitstrategymastery.com. Just as it sounds, exitstrategymastery.com. And there's a free consultation. It's either going to be with Morty or I, and there's also a couple of ebooks. There's some other resources there that talk all about preparing for any exit, including, the same thing I said to my friend who I thought should have gone through the ESOP door because of these different elements. And he kind of agreed with me afterwards. I still was congratulations, because when you do have that exit, nobody gets taking profit. And it was so hard to build the enterprises that you're building. Whatever exit door suits you. So yes. The goal is you need to be in shape, because if you're not, financial statements don't have integrity, got client concentration, different elements, they diminish your value. They could likely derail the transaction, and you want to prepare for all those things. So go to exitstrategymastery.com. R Harmon at CSG Partners is my email, RHARMON@CSGpartners.com. And you can send me an email. I'm happy to get on a conversation, Frank, with anybody you ever want me to talk to. And I'm running into a lot of owners, including some budding franchisors, some people who've got great businesses and they want to bring it to different markets and they're exploring. And I'm certainly connecting you in those circumstances. And the good news is, private equity is an interesting exit, but it's something to me when I sold my tech staffing business, we sold to a company, and because we were well prepared, because we were audited out the gate by a big firm, we were able to roll right into an IPO. And if we had not been prepared, we would have missed that opportunity. But the moment we sold, as a friend of mine always used to say, who would buy all these publishing companies, goes, you understand, you're going to get a nice check, but post-sale, you've been bought. Life is not the same. You're not the king. You're not the crown prince anymore in most circumstances, 99 out of 100 times. Once in a while, they'll buy you and you'll still be the king and the crown prince. Life changes. And I remember a year after selling my technology staffing business and walking around our old offices, we had, for a period of time, we had sublet 10,000 feet from Nestle Foods. And it was poignant because I wasn't the king anymore. Yeah, now I had some money in the bank and that felt really, really good. But, with an ESOP, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. And you can take care of your team and you can take care of the top people as well outside of the ESOP structure. You're still allowed to pay people bonuses, whatever you like, in terms of, things that aren't ESOP related and the share allocation value there. But again, I could go on and on and on. I think that the fun part for your team and the takeaway is for every 100,000 in profit you generate, especially as you get to just that mass of a couple $1 million or more in profit, you've created 10 times that in equity you're going to be able to harvest. And you're doing it while providing services that are obviously very valuable for folks. So
Richard, that was fantastic. Thank you. That was a lot of fun. And I hope our audience got a lot out of it. I know that I wish I could have prepared myself better during my entrepreneur journey. And with that said, Richard, thank you so much. And I'll see you soon.
We'll see you soon. Thank you for the time today, Frank. How wonderful to spend the time
Thank you for tuning into the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. For additional insights, guest applications, and to stay connected, visit us at efbpodcast.com. The Emerging Franchise Brands podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of Emerging Franchise Brands, its host Frank Fiume, or Emerging Franchise Group, LLC. Any discussed franchise or investment opportunity requires thorough investigation, obtaining proper disclosure documents, and expert consultation before making any investment decisions. The podcast and its host do not offer professional advice or endorsements, and they hold no responsibility for actions, representations, accuracy, or consequential damages related to the podcast content.